You cannot go live with the new financial system unless this is in place. And I've spent hundreds of hours mapping all of this stuff out just for this video. And the point here isn't to start a new narrative or get you all emotional. I just want to highlight something about this new financial system that truly determines whether it can go live or not. So in this video, I'm going to explain why the compliance world of the new financial system presents the biggest asymmetrical opportunity for you in 2026 before this new financial system takes place. I'm going to give you the exact events and things to look for that would confirm this direction. And what you don't see a lot on YouTube is I'm also going to give you the invalidation triggers, the things that would happen that would invalidate the whole core thesis around this video. And not only that, I'm going to point you in the direction of some assets, some exposure that you can have to this compliance world that I see presenting a huge opportunity pre-new financial system. I'll speak for you here, but I think what you want is you want to know actually what's happening. And as a result of that information, you can determine where the opportunities are. Because you've seen over the last 5 years or so, the assets that you've been invested in haven't really moved, certainly haven't moved versus what everyone has been saying they're going to do. If you're a little bit tired of that and you just want to know what the actual information is and where the opportunities are, this is the video. So we're going to do 3 things to start with. I'm going to explain what compliance means in this whole new system. I'm actually going to give you a validation and invalidation checklist. Then I'll show you specifically what I'm watching in terms of assets in 2026 that ties perfectly along with this thesis. So really this whole category comes down to compliance and control, and they are 2 separate different things. I want to just explain what each one of them is first. Compliance is basically the question of, are you able to do this? Are you allowed to do this? Are you able to make this transaction? In there, you have KYC, you have sanctions, you have AML, even the ability to check to see if the sender has the funds that they want to send. All of that falls within compliance. The control element is asking the question, are you even allowed to do this? And if you are allowed to do this, under what rules are you doing this? So in this video, when I say compliance is moving into money, I mean something very specific. Typically, compliance and control is handled after the payment intent. And so it adds a lot of time to the process, and we will talk about that. What I'm suggesting is that compliance and control will be embedded into the payment itself, therefore reducing the amount of time taken for any transactions and actually increasing the accuracy of those transactions. Now, we've all heard people saying that money is just going to be faster in the future, but I think it's more nuanced than that. I think the future isn't just fast money. I think it's programmable money. And that's a very big difference. And that means the shift from where we are right now isn't just, make payments quicker. It's more about how close can we get the compliance and control to the transaction itself. And when I say embedded into the transaction, I don't mean embedded. I mean like actually part of the money. So the money itself is doing the compliance and control checks, not having it as a separate thing that happens later so you can think about it. And if you're listening to all this and you think this is so boring, it is, but the biggest opportunities I think are presenting themselves in the boring side of finance, and that is compliance and control, right? What could be more boring? But what we're looking at is actual infrastructure here. Now I think about it, Rails is actually just kind of obvious. Everyone can see that. But compliance, because it's so boring, there's a whole load of people that just resist going into that as a deep dive. But therein lies the big pot of gold. I want to explain the bottleneck to you, the big issue, because you have to understand the issue to know the solution, right? And you have to understand the solution in order to know the assets that solve that problem. So as we move into this new financial system, there are going to be multiple different venues. You're going to have CBDC venues, you're going to have private ledgers, you're going to have all over the place. There's going to be these shared environments. In some of these, you might have a whole bunch of different countries participating in their own currencies in these pools. And then you have another group of countries that go in their own pool. And so when you separate out these ledgers in multiple ways, you create what's called fragmentation. And even though this new financial system is very smart and very interesting, it doesn't solve all the problems inherently. Like having multiple different venues and different ledgers for these transactions creates fragmentation naturally. So if we followed that train of thought into the new financial system that's just going to be fragmented, well, if compliance and control is treated separately, every single transaction, it creates a massive amount of friction. Because it goes like this. Let's say you've got 10 different stopping points on one single transaction, let's say. Well, between every step of the process, every part of the journey of that money has to go through its own individual compliance checks. So imagine that transaction as it flows through the whole system, there's just friction endlessly all the way into the end. So it's my thesis that compliance and control will actually come into the money itself and be part of money. And the only way you can really make it part of money is to have programmable money, right? Programmed in such a way where the compliance and control takes place within the money itself. I know it's kind of an abstract thought, but truly think about this. We have fragmentation. It's very slow because of compliance and control. If there's any bottleneck that you can see there, it's that compliance and control is really causing a lot of friction, even in the new financial system. So that is the bottleneck. You have to take away the compliance and control problems, move it into the money via programmable money, which we already know is coming, right? Allowing a transaction to go from point A to point B without the 10 steps, just one central verification, compliance and control result that covers that entire transaction. So if compliance and control was part of the money, it would mean that all of those compliance and control checks would happen before the payment even starts. And so instead of going 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 all the way across to its destination, it just goes from A to B instantly because the compliance and control is already handled. That's part one of my theory. Part two of my theory is that we're moving into a world of tokenized assets. Every asset in the world eventually will just be tokenized. What I mean by tokenized is just put onto the blockchain, represented on the blockchain. If you're interested in knowing truly what tokenization actually is from a mechanical standpoint, the video coming out in a couple of days will explain tokenization in detail so you can explain it to anyone you meet. So when you're transacting tokenized assets, you're not necessarily transacting the value of that asset necessarily. What you are controlling is its state, who actually owns that thing. So it's less about sending messages back and forth and more about making sure that the ownership of the asset, the state of the asset, is actually changed in that transaction. So again, when you look at compliance and control outside of a transaction, that causes a lot of friction. Because we're moving to this new world of tokenization, you're going to have to move compliance closer to the transaction, if not part of the transaction. When you're talking about tokenization specifically, there are rules of ownership that you have to abide by. It would really solve a problem if you could do all the compliance and control checks before a tokenized asset is actually transferred, meaning you can confirm the state of the asset and who the asset goes to, and all of that determines if the payment actually gets sent or not. So I think if there is a way to transfer ownership immediately, that's going to be a preferred outcome. And the third element of this, I want you to try to visualize something for me because I think it explains it really well. Let's say you've got a department store in the mall, right? There's CCTV cameras around everywhere. You could be someone who's unvetted, unverified. You can walk into this department store, steal a load of things, and then leave. And it's only later when the CCTV footage is pulled that you're now in trouble, right? Now, it's only at that point, there's like a delayed moment in time where you are recognized for, bad behavior. That's fine, but it's a bit antiquated and it leaves a lot to desire in terms of like efficiency, because there's a lot more efficient ways to do that. Now imagine if you go up to that same department store and before you go into the store, there's a guy at the door and he verifies who you are. He kind of vets you, makes sure that you're mentally stable, that you're not there to steal something, and then lets you in, right? This is the exact same thing as how compliance works right now. Compliance is kind of like a delayed process, but you could change that and have it part of the process of going into the shop, right? You don't even get into the shop without the compliance element. And that's why it's kind of silly to focus entirely on the rails of the system without acknowledging the prerequisite conditions to make that payment even happen on the rails in the first place. The payment won't reach the rails if it doesn't get through compliance and control. So the real bottleneck here isn't the big problems that XRP is solving, the Rails solutions are solving. No, it's what happens before that. You have no new financial system without compliance and control. This is why I think 2026 gets really interesting, because you're not looking for who has the fastest rails for the new financial system. And I don't believe the biggest opportunities lay there. I think the biggest opportunities lie in the infrastructure that determines who's allowed to make a payment. All of this compliance stuff that I've been talking about, right? I believe this is one of the opportunities to be involved in 2026. Now, I'm not actually here to try and make you believe me, because this is just the way things are going. We've had indications that the world is moving towards this programmable money side of things. Compliance and control would be part of that programming. So bringing compliance and control into the money rather than a separate process. This is stuff you can't really debate and argue with. I believe the real bottleneck in this new financial system is compliance and control. But I think there are assets that surround that bottleneck that are trying to unwind it to kind of free up that bottleneck that will see the highest asymmetrical opportunity in 2026. So in order to track that my thesis, that we are moving in that direction of bringing compliance and control into money, to confirm that thesis or to validate that thesis, there are a series of things that I'm looking for that would validate this direction. I'm going to share them with you now. So the first confirmation we're really looking for is when people are making payments, specifically in even pilot situations, are some transactions getting blocked before the transaction actually takes place? So what we're saying is that if a transaction happens and it doesn't meet the AML or KYC requirements of compliance and control, if there are notifications that would say, we'll monitor it, we're going to check back on this later, that would indicate that we haven't installed programmable money. But if you start seeing language like enforced whitelists or something like only approved wallets can participate, this would confirm to us that this direction is being moved into. That means they're putting the compliance first before the transaction can take place. So I'm actively tracking all of these confirmations and invalidations when we get to them all the time. I want to make sure that I know immediately when something has been confirmed or invalidated, because that can push me towards being more bullish for that opportunity or less bullish or more bearish, right? And this is the value of having confirmations and invalidations, because you can start to weight your confidence based on what's actually happening rather than what someone else is saying. The second confirmation we would be looking for is when the banks start to issue their policies as part of the code infrastructure of the way they operate. Right now, policies can be found in documentation, like these are the rules that we abide by. Here's a PDF of it. And part of that delayed process for actually doing the checks later on is so that a human can come in and have a look and see, did we follow the rules? Now, if policy is code and it's no longer on these PDFs, that means decisions are being made in a more automated, systematic way, which would also suggest that compliance is moving closer towards the money. And again, that would confirm the thesis. Now, the third confirmation is a little bit of a tangent, but it completely relates to what we're talking about. And it is in the whole world of ID. Because identification obviously plays a massive role in the compliance element of this. Checking who are you, who am I in a transaction is obviously really part of this. Now, as I said about the fragmentation, if we don't solve this bottleneck, each part of the step will require its own new, fresh ID kind of presentation. So imagine those 10 different steps in a transaction. Every single one of those, you've got to represent an identification, check who you are, who they are, who you are, who they are, every single step of the process. Again, that's loads of friction. But if you start to see language about IDs becoming portable, this is really important information. Portable, that means you can have your ID check at the beginning and it applies across all the different ledgers, all the different transaction types you can do, really slowing down that transaction speed and bringing compliance and identification into the money itself. The money can't move if it isn't compliant, and it can't be compliant if the IDs haven't been approved. So as soon as you start seeing IDs being portable in this new financial system, you know that compliance has been brought closer to the money. Confirmation number 4 might be a little bit scary, but this is when you start seeing banks actually restricting the certain payments for certain reasons. One of the key nuances of this is that they're treating programmable money not as kind of like a buzzword or like a fun new thing, but actually just as the way the system is. And there'll be slight linguistic changes in the way that they communicate these things that would suggest, this is actually in place. And we're not just trying to sound cool by saying programmable money. Confirmation number 5 is when these real settlement networks, like you've got DTCC or Euroclear, they would actually start announcing that they're standardizing how these controls and compliance actually work. And so you really have to be looking for frameworks for compliance and control from these entities, publishing them. They will publish them as live press releases and all that kind of stuff. They'll talk about compliance logic and permissions, identity checks and auditability. And that's when it won't just be a pilot or a one-off experiment, and this is actually being embedded in the new system. So you might not know, but all of this information is actually condensed, all put together into one single kind of research brief. Research to this degree is usually only provided to these big hedge funds and banks kind of behind closed doors. And I realized this in my research, that this stuff isn't shared with the public. And one thing I noticed about their research that is never shared on a public scale are the invalidation triggers. What things can happen that show us that the thesis that we have about compliance coming in closer to money is actually incorrect and it's moving in a different direction. Ultimately, what I look for is having a high degree of confirmation and a low degree of invalidation, and that determines how heavily I move my investments around and in what assets. Now, obviously, there are lots of talks like in Project Agora, where they're basically just flirting with the idea of having these unified environments where you can transact all kind of together and settle payments, and there's kind of this unified ledger kind of conversation. If they start pushing towards that and then just stop all of a sudden, like that's not the direction they're going, then that would invalidate the thesis. So if you see something like Project Agora, they might release an update or something and suggest that it's actually just better to send messages between these different venues, then that's probably an invalidation signal towards this whole compliance closer to money conversation. That would suggest that compliance is further away from money and they're okay with that. So you'll end up hearing a lot about connectivity and less about gating and restriction. But for this thesis to be confirmed, you'd need to see a lot more conversations about restriction and gating of payments. Invalidation number 2 would be if you had some sort of documentation published about how each individual bank will need its own compliance and control stack process individually to each institution or bank, right? So they would be handling their own compliance in their own way in a very siloed fashion. That would be an invalidation for this thesis. Invalidation number 3 is if we start to see regulators say that we are not going to be programming money. That's obviously a very clear and obvious signal, but it would invalidate this thesis. Invalidation number 4 would be if privacy concerns, the whole idea of maintaining a level of privacy, restricts compliance. This would only happen if they end up prioritizing privacy and are happy for compliance to take place in a separate location. There is actually something called the Digital Euro Scheme Rulebook, and they build the rules around this exact thing. But they really do stress the idea of having high standards for privacy and data protection. So if they end up saying that we can't enforce this programmable thing or we can't enforce compliance without breaching data privacy, then that's a big invalidation. And the 5th invalidation is if ID never actually becomes portable. I find that really hard to imagine that they would just allow, like I said, with the transaction with 10 stops, to just have 10 different KYC checks every time. It doesn't make any sense to do that. So this is highly unlikely for it to be invalidated. But still, if it were invalidated, it would clearly show us that the thesis is in the wrong direction. The way I look at it is if you've got 3 or 4 of those positive confirmations about this thesis, you can use that information to start allocating or getting exposure to the assets that are solving the problems in that area. But if you have more invalidation than validation, you're obviously going to pay less attention to the assets that are within that bottleneck. Because if it is becoming invalidated, it means the bottleneck is actually somewhere else and not necessarily in compliance and control. So now that we've done that part, the part that most people skip, now let's get into where the opportunities are in terms of asset exposure. And remember, the goal here is to position ourselves around the bottleneck of the problem, because the projects around the bottleneck will at some point free the bottleneck. And that's the exact type of situation where there is a mass repricing of all of the assets and the projects around that bottleneck. They immediately go to a new price. So if you want to be part of a repricing, put your hand up. I absolutely do. That's why I'm here. Now, I really want to make this very clear. What I'm about to talk about with these assets is not financial advice. I'm not telling you to buy these assets. I'm simply telling you where the projects are and the assets related to those projects around a bottleneck that we can clearly see. And that's based on a thesis that can be proven wrong or proven right over time. Nothing is certain. I just want you to know that. And that's the lovely thing about this, right? We're on a sliding scale of confidence rather than a yes, this is a good thing or no, this is a bad thing. Because it's yes or no binary thinking that gets people into a position where they win or they lose, rather than the way the funds do it is to what degree have we won, to what degree have we lost. But you're always pointing yourself in the positive direction because of the confirmations and invalidations. If you simply have more confirmations for a thesis coming true, then it's far more likely for that exposure to be asymmetrical and go up in value. So you're really making the odds in your favor this way by going through this boring process. So it's one thing just to get the assets that are around the bottleneck, and we've got those and we're going to get into that. But the most important thing for me is narrowing it down a level further. And this level further, nobody does. And it absolutely makes the difference. Okay, so let's do it. So the level deeper I want to go is I will always ask, once I've seen the assets and I know the companies involved in the bottleneck, I'll always ask the next question, which is, if this project, if this company, if this crypto is successful, do the tokenomics, the mechanics around the way tokens are used in that project, actively change the price of the cryptocurrency involved? Because we've seen there are sometimes Just because the company is doing really well, it doesn't have a correlation necessarily, or at least it has a weak correlation to the price of the asset going up. I'm strictly speaking from a utility perspective here. Obviously, any project in the world, whether that's baby Doge Moon or whatever it is, if there's a speculative angle to it, they can go up in value. It doesn't matter about the utility, they can just go up. I'm talking specifically from a utility-driven perspective. If this project does well, and if this crypto is used in the way it's supposed to be, does that have a positive impact on the price of the asset from a mechanical standpoint? And so I narrow it all down using that filter, and what you end up with is the residual, the few assets at the end that actually are impacted based on the success of the project. And remember, we're positioning ourselves around a bottleneck that needs to be solved, and the solution to the bottleneck is the specific asset that will be repriced and be successful as a result of it solving the problem, therefore getting a reprice, presenting us with an asymmetrical opportunity. And with that information, I start to score the assets. Obviously, the higher scores will rank higher, and I'll be more inclined to dedicate exposure to those assets. So what I hope you're seeing here is not purchases based on belief or any narratives, only based on the evidence. So if you're doing your research and you're building a thesis and you're trying to develop, it's really nice to be able to see all of your assets in one central place and track them as they go in live real time. And eToro is a platform that allows you to do just that. You can track all of your theses in one central location with not just crypto projects, but also equities as well on the eToro platform. If you're in the UK, eToro are doing this really cool promotion where if you create and fund an account, they will give you up to $500 of one of the assets that I hold in my own portfolio. If you're not in the UK, you don't get access to that deal, but you can still use the platform and have both your equities and your crypto exposures all listed in one portfolio location. So with that said, let's get into the actual assets that surround this bottleneck that we've been talking about in compliance and control. And starting off in tier 1, this is the top tier, the most relevant asset in this bottleneck, and it's Chainlink. By the way, I explain all of the rationale and actually invalidations for every asset I'm about to talk about as well in my full macro brief. In tier 2, we have Quant, and in tier 3, it's obviously a lower asymmetry in terms of like the increase in price as a result of compliance and control, but it would be Ethereum. Those 3 assets are surrounding that bottleneck right now. I know they're very well-known cryptos, but as I've done lots of these research briefs and created a lot of research documentation, sometimes these ideas and these research briefs take us to very, very small assets, very, very undervalued assets, I will say. And so exposure in those ones is really exciting. I want to tell you that the banks and the institutions and the big hedge funds have been operating in a pay-to-win environment. They pay people for these massive research lists with validations and invalidations and exposure lists and a sliding scale of confidence on each one of those. And they use that information to build incredible portfolios with massive growth potential. It's my whole intention to bring these research briefs to you, to the public. I think this should be accessible to you. So I've put together 4 of my absolute best research briefs with all of the validations and invalidations, all the theses, and all of the exposure assets. I've called them the macro pack. If you want the macro pack, it's absolutely free, by the way. Again, I want to make this available to you. All you have to do is put the link in the description. I'll send you through the 4 research briefs. It can take you 20 minutes if you want to skim. It can take you 4 hours if you actually want to do some reading. So I've given you the whole framework here, the thesis, the mechanism behind it, the reason the bottleneck is there, the confirmations, the invalidations, and even an exposure list of the assets surrounding that bottleneck. If you really enjoyed this video and this deep dive information of my research briefs, every Tuesday on this channel, you're going to get a video just like this. A whole new thesis, more confirmations, more invalidations, and exposure lists. One of the assets on our exposure list was Dusk previously, and that's gone up like 700% in the last couple of days. So this is worth paying attention to. Get the macro pack right now in the description. I'll see you in a couple of days for the next video explaining exactly, mechanically, how tokenization works.